Welcome to the third episode of our series on resilience, innovation, and the Alberta economy. And this episode will be focused on the role of government specifically and the views of various industries and professions on the economy and on the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystem. And with us today is our commentator, Brad Ferguson. He and I will be discussing the forces and sources of change having a bearing on resilience and on the ecosystem. So I've known Brad for some years. And as the consultant with me with KPMG Consulting, and prior to that with Procter & Gamble. But Brad's been a man around town as the CEO of Economic Development Edmonton, also a man around the province and some of the work that he's done on ESG and now at a national level. So I'm not going to give a lot more detail, Brad. I will ask you to introduce yourself before we get started.
Well, thanks, Perry. And it's great to be here. And I participated, in the audience and asking some questions, but nice to be asked to be on a little bit of a panel from a commentator point of view. I owe a lot of my start to Perry, and I didn't have an MBA and I needed to learn a lot about business very quickly. And he took me under his wing back in the day when I was given a desk and a phone, and he said, I don't expect to ever see you at the desk. If you don't hunt and kill, you won't eat. And I learned a lot about resourcefulness and survival strategies in the world of consulting through him. So since then, I've had a fabulous run or a career. Took on an operating role with Edmonton Economic Development from 2012 to 15 when all the downtown development was starting, and really we were responsible for a quarter of all net new jobs in the country for 5 years straight. It was just a tremendous time for the city when we were also shifting the brand from an industrial brand to a much more progressive brand. And then from that, I just took on a number of really interesting projects as a CEO, a turnaround or a startup. And then I got asked by Premier Kenney to go into government as the Assistant Deputy Minister in charge of the ESG Secretariat when they started that up, and kind of taking that from a blank sheet of paper where we couldn't spell ESG to eventually a framework that I think is starting to become quite developed and accepted across the country. I'm doing a similar project in Ontario. And then I also am on the board of Investing Canada, and we're starting to adopt a very similar framework at that stage too. So, I attribute a lot of it, and Perry doesn't know this, but I speak of him fondly in most of my introductions, and it goes back to a lot of those roots. So delight to be here and delight to be commentating with which should be an interesting discussion.
Well, thank you, Brad, and thanks for the compliment as well. So as we get started and start getting into the data, I'll mention to those of you that might be watching with a cell phone, that I'll talk in a little bit more detail than you might typically expect, because of the fact that I know many people do watch this off a cell phone. So our objectives today from an industry and professions perspective were to show you a profile of the province and of the regions from the perspective of the blend of regions, professions and industries, and then look at how each of them assess economic resilience. And then the section on the role of governments, you'll see, as we have spoken of in earlier webinars, that the regions are bipolar in their perspective, with the Edmonton region supporting more and the Calgary less government intervention. And that's a clear distinction. And we do ask the question why, and I think we dig into that a little bit deeper in this webinar. Others, and that is outside of Edmonton and Calgary, expect more government intervention in developing infrastructure, but otherwise less. We do ask the question, are there differences between the industries, professions, and the regions as it relates to economic resilience, and also the innovation ecosystem? So I'm going to show you here what the industries and professions that people are most familiar with that answered the survey, because that was one of the earlier questions, is tell us what industries and professions you're most familiar with. And then what we do is we look at those with a familiarity in one industry or another and match that against how they assessed economic resilience to get a reading for various industries and professions. Well, this is 2023. You'll see the various sectors. Education and research was was one of the primary contributors as far as areas of interest. Then, of course, government, then infotech, then industry, then energy, and then management. Then it drops down into health, engineering, environment, et cetera. So there are 22 different industries and professions that we monitor over and above public sector, meaning health, education, government, environment, et cetera. So this is the percentage of those who in the survey responded that this was an area of interest. When you look at the industries, 36% of the respondents had industry as a represented, 29% identified professions, and 35% public service. So we had reasonably good balance in the survey between each of the sectors. The representation from mining is quite weak, and forestry and wood products, again, 3%, and legal and security, 4%. So any data that we gather or refer to from those sectors is quite weak, and we don't make a big point of it. But we've got strong representation from agriculture, strong representation from infotech, and strong recommendations from environment, health, and government. So in that respect, we're pretty confident that the data we've got is reflective of those industries, and in addition, those that are in the 15% plus. So we have strong representation of environment, health, and government, agriculture, energy, infotech, and engineering. That's a pretty good balance of the diversity that exists within our economy. Now, Brad, you've worked in Edmonton. You're certainly familiar with Calgary. When you look at the balance, just from industries and professions and government itself, do you want any color from the perspective you have of the balance of representation that we see between the communities, or from your perspective?
Well, I think I love the fact that we broke it down into three things that I would normally say. One is revenue producing, which is industries, the goods or things that we can export, things that create wealth. The professions, which is the cost structure. It's the cost of those that produce, costs associated with producing goods. And then you have overhead, which is public service. And I when I first saw the slide that you put up, I just kind of mentally categorized it into, and if it's a third, that's a high overhead factor, first of all. But I think, Calgary would be, in my mind, very much stronger on the industry and profession side and just less public service. And you realize that the Edmonton-based economy has so much public service, and then the strength of the education and the health system centered traditionally out of Edmonton has changed a lot in the last 10 years. But clearly Edmonton will be overweighted on the public service side when we get into the other data probably that'll follow.
But this, while there may be a concentration of one sector versus another in one region or another, this is where the jobs are. When you think about where people are employed in the province, this is pretty good representation of the distribution. So we'll go on from there. We're now getting into numbers, and I've got to provide some explanation here. That the numbers which I showed you earlier were 2021 and the distribution. What we're looking at now is the distribution for 2023 and what changes we have in the survey. So I cited those pluses, plus 5% for mining, mean represent only 4% of the respondents represented mining, but in 2023 it was 9%, so it was up 5%. When we look at agriculture, we've seen a decline of about 7%. When we look over in the professions, we've seen a little bit of decline, what was originally low anyway in legal, but a rise of 5% in management. And then in public sector, that's where we've had the biggest transition. We've had a somewhat of a decline in health, and somewhat of a decline in environment, but an increase in education, an increase in government. Now, I'm just citing this to reflect on how much variance there is between over a 3 to 4 year period. In industries, the variance was only about 3%. The variance in professions was only a couple of percent. A lot more of a mix in the public sector. But again, the sectors, 34%, 33%, 33%, we're still a third, with the public services mix changing somewhat more government and education and less in health and environment. So I just wanted to reinforce the equity of the representation from the various sectors. Now we're getting into a measurement of how Alberta in 2021 viewed the economic resilience of the province, and now in 2023 for industries, professions, and public sector. The overview in 2021 is that we're weak in resilience, meaning that index column should be around 3 in order to be at all at the bottom level of resilient. The number runs from 1 to 5, with 5 being very resilient, 3 being neutral. So we see in 2021, all 3, industries, professions, and public sector, well, particularly industries, we're near that 3 mark, with public sector being the weaker. And the percentage of those that actually said it was resilient or very resilient was 36% in industries, 28%, 38% in professions. The highest among the industries were in energy, agriculture, and construction, and the lowest being in forestry. And you might recall back in 2021, we had quite a collapse in the price of lumber. In the professions, it was communications and infotech, and in public sector, health and environment were the highest of all being weak, with education being the weakest. The change we see between 2021 and 2023 is 48% overall said the province was resilient versus 36% in 2021. So we had quite an improvement. And the resilience was improved across all sectors, with only public sector lagging. In other words, it didn't reach that 3 mark. It was increased, but it didn't reach the 3 mark. And for those that call the province's economy resilient, 39% in public sector, but above 50% in the other sectors. So all sectors are strong in industry, with the weakest being construction. Management, finance, and infotech being highest in the ranking for the professions, with communications again this time being weaker. In the public sector, all sectors were weak. None of them reached the 3 mark, with education being considerably weaker. So that mix of industry and public sector is reasonable to get some sense of the variability that exists between jobs in various sectors. I don't know whether you want to add any color here or bring any of your perspective to bear here, or any questions you might have, Brad.
Really 2 observations or comments. One, when I was at Edmonton Economic Development, we always looked at the resilience of our city versus Calgary, and then we looked at it versus other major metropolitan areas across the country. And I was always surprised that on a scale, we actually came out quite resilient versus, even though we were born and raised with this understanding that we needed to constantly diversify the economy. We were boom bust. When we looked at other cities, we were actually quite resilient. So I'd be interested first, Perry, if you contrasted these against any other jurisdictions in the country, so to determine if 3 is high or low compared to some of the others. The others, I always have a hard time understanding resilience within the public sector, and to say that they're the least resilient is usually, I'm just a little surprised by it, as they tend to be the most resilient. So
let me tweak this for a moment, because this is important for as we proceed through. Remember, this is a sentiment survey. I'm asking people their opinion. I'm not going out and getting statistics on unemployment or interest rates or any quantitative measure about the economy, other than people's attitude, the feeling that they are expressing. And secondly, they're expressing the resilience of their economy. It doesn't necessarily mean they're rating government. So when you see the low number for public sector is saying the economy of the province is weak. Now, the fact that they're familiar with the public sector may well be that filter, and I suspect that is the case. We're taking an extra step when we say that sector is resilient. What we should be saying is that sector views the province as less resilient.
Great, thanks.
In other words, if I'm running an election or I'm running for a position of influence, I should know how the public sector views the economy, and the public sector views the economy as weaker than those who are in industry or in the professions. It's subtle, I know, but it's an important distinction that we're really measuring sentiment here.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. So does resilience differ between the regions? That's what we've already been referring to, incidentally, without the data in front of us. So I'm diving right into 2023. The overview for the Calgary region is the economy is viewed as resilient, 51% overall. For industries, 64%, professions, 48%, public sector, only 41%. When we look at the index, you can see it's above 3. for industries and professions, and close to 3 for public sector in Calgary. We look at what's highest, all except manufacturing in Calgary, with the weakest being manufacturing, the highest in the professions being communications, engineering, management, and finance. Clearly, industry supporting processes, with legal and human resources being the weakest. And we suspect human resources may be a reflection of the problems we're having in finding labor with the recovery. And in public sector, the highest is health, but the weakest, again, repeatedly, is education. When we look at the Edmonton region, we get a slightly different mix. More than half of the industry interests viewed the economy as resilient, in stark contrast with the public sector and professions, each of which were very low. When you get below 2, you got to realize that there's almost no 5s and 4s. You're dealing with a few 3s and a lot of 1s and 2s. So a very negative perspective on the resilience of the economy among the professions and public sector. The strongest, however, being management, finance, infotech, and legal, with engineering being weak in Calgary, which may have been stronger in the past, and public sector government being the highest among the weakest, and again, education being weak. So the summary is at the bottom. Calgary exceeds Edmonton in construction and engineering and environment and in energy as a view of the resilience of the economy, whereas Edmonton exceeds Calgary in legal, manufacturing, which I found interesting, human resources, agriculture, and government. Where we are aligned, and that is where Calgary and Edmonton as 2 regions are aligned, is around tourism, where the difference is 0. Infotech almost identical, education very close, health very close, management, transportation quite close. So I refer those, there's an alignment of perspective. Anything here catch your eye, Brad, that you want to elaborate on or query?
Not a lot surprises me, but it actually, I love the numbers. When you look at Calgary region and you look at the industry at 64%, very strong. And it's, that's that optimism that they have, is when the first uptick comes, Calgary is the first to jump on and be extremely optimistic, and Edmonton will continue to look at their belly buttons and kind of think that we're going to mope our way through this for a while before we start to believe that it's actually something good is happening. And we battled that in Edmonton. We battled that. It was that self-esteem issue of Edmontonians. They were very quick to get down on themselves, and I equate that a little bit to our kind of the economic structure of the city. But it's just good to see Calgary. And Calgary's got, what we see in the industry side, they've got such an American influence in terms of, the demographics that live in Calgary. There's such an American influence in, in the industry sector. So when we do see an uptick in Calgary, that US, we can win, we want to win, we're very positive, we're aggressive, we're competitive. All that drives an attitude of the city, which is kind of, if we're talking sentiment, this doesn't surprise me at all. Edmonton, and I think it's struggling with this right now, is it's still navel gazing, and it's there's a lot of good things that are happening in Edmonton, not necessarily in the downtown, but around that ring road, where you're looking at the more industrial sectors are doing exceptionally well. But most of our noise in the city is amplified by the negativity in the downtown core and lack of action, et cetera. But that actually reflects a very small part of the Edmonton economy. So this doesn't surprise me. It reinforces, I think, what we battled with way back in 2012 is how do we get out of that self-esteem issue and realize there's more to, there's so much more optimism that Edmontonians should have, very consistent with what we see in Calgary.
Yeah, you and I chatted briefly about that negative index and negative perspective among the professions in Edmonton, which was not the case in Calgary, implying that those professions are probably in some way involved in public sector, because there's such a strong representation of public sector in Edmonton with health, education, and government. So that might be part of the explanation of what's happening in the professions there, because that came as somewhat of a surprise.
Sure, but you look at public sector in Edmonton at 19%. That is ridiculously low, and yet, and drags down the entire Edmonton index. Yeah. So if one in three houses in Edmonton works for the public sector, which is what they do, and if it's not your house and it's not the house on your left, it's the house on the right, one of you has such a negative outlook on the economy that it actually brings down the entire block.
One other interesting thing from here is the difference between Edmonton and Calgary in manufacturing. And I must confess, I'm not all that familiar with the manufacturing sector, other than I remember Bill Smith doing a consultation some years ago on how to build manufacturing. And my perspective was Edmonton was basically a throughput economy. We didn't stop meat, wheat, fiber, timber, oil, and gas from passing. We had it pass right through the city. But Edmonton has, in fact, been developing a manufacturing sector to the point that it appears to be exceeding that of Calgary significantly. Is there anything behind that, or is this just a statistical anomaly?
No, I think, I'm not sure if it started back in Bill Smith's days, but right after, but, there was very much an initiative to stop the throughput and at least do some value add work. And we have a very quiet manufacturing sector in a lot of chemical work, small companies that actually aggregate together for a lot, quite a significant manufacturing sector. And it's proven to be quite resilient. So, not just a throughput, but a supplier to those things up north, as everything up north is not exploration in terms of the energy sector, but a manufacturing. Like the oil sands is really just a manufacturing plant now, and the suppliers to that has created an opportunity for it to be much more stable manufacturing sector in Edmonton.
Anything that you want to share regarding energy? I mean, I'm not surprised at all, and no one would be, to see energy as a subsector in industries being high in Calgary and carrying much to a positive extent with it. But in Edmonton, energy was weakest among the industries. Now, it may be that's field services. I don't know quite what it is about the energy sector, or whether or not it's broader. Maybe energy is wind, solar, and people aren't just thinking oil anymore. But any idea why energy would come in weak in Edmonton?
The only thing that I'll gravitate to is the major producers in the oil sands region have made a tremendous amount of money, which and their margins are very high, and that bodes well for Calgary. But what happens is they squeeze the supply chain, and a lot of Edmonton-based companies that are energy driven have had their margins squeezed significantly all the way through the supply chain. And so it's interesting. I'd love to dive in a little deeper to the sentiment around where groups are, where companies are in the supply chain around that sentiment, because what we've seen in Edmonton is that margin squeeze that we saw 5 years ago hasn't come back as prices have come back. And so there's more wealth creation in Calgary, and still people are getting squeezed in Edmonton. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that'd be my observation just based on what I'm seeing here.
The other regions for which we don't have a lot of data may provide some insights, is that more than 60% of the industry interests were viewing the economy as resilient in the rural areas or outside of Edmonton and Calgary. And again, we didn't have enough data to parse north, central, and south, so it's quite a collage. But the stark contrast again was with public sector and professions, looking like other regions reflect almost what's going on in Edmonton, with the highest being forestry and agriculture, the weakest again being energy. Mining in the southern Alberta was stronger by far than elsewhere. And among the professions, the highest here now being engineering, infotech, and finance. Nothing weak worth referring to, but education once again came in weak in the public sector in the rural areas. So you made the observation, and it caught me not by surprise, but it was informative, that Edmonton in some way does reflect, or other regions does reflect, at least economically, Edmonton better than Calgary.
Yeah, I think it does. I think Edmonton has, so if I categorize Edmonton as rural, even within the country. So we used to always say, 95% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, 50% of everyone else lives in Edmonton, and the rest live in rural. And so Edmonton and rural Canada tend to have a little bit of the same mentality, a little bit, not necessarily, I don't know, beliefs around the economy or in terms of self-esteem and the sentiment, but there's a lot of similarities in the Edmonton mindset and the rural mindset. And I think this drives into a bigger discussion around, we used to think it's east-west divide, and then we've seen kind of the divide between the resource sector and, the other sectors. And what I'm really seeing right now is a urban-rural divide, and Edmonton's part of that rural. And Calgary's part of the urban. So you have Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary as the urban centers, and the rest of the country, including Edmonton, is part of a rural divide. And I think there's a lot to that in terms of sentiment and beliefs around government as well. So
Barry's with us today and has made the observation in numerous instances that one of the global phenomenon that's been going on now for 20 some odd years is urbanization. Calgary's certainly feeling it, both from an immigration perspective as well as drawing a population from its rural areas. Edmonton as well is feeling the urbanization, but perhaps not quite to the extent with the immigration that Calgary, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto for sure are feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Toronto today, and Toronto does not look like the rest of the country. You walk down Yonge Street, Bay Street, you look in my office, I've got 400 people right here. And this is not resembling of the rest of the country. It's very different. And so I think there's a lot of similarities, especially in Edmonton, where a lot of rural kids go to school, then they stay there after those rural roots. You're 1 degree or 1 generation off the farm. Anthropologically, you're not going to be thinking in an urban mindset, even after 4 years of university. So if you stay in Edmonton and you get married, you have kids, a lot of those rural mindset roots still infiltrate the city of Edmonton as they do some of the smaller cities across the country.
Thanks for that color. We've now shifted into the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystem, leaving the discussion around economic diversification. Let me just sit on my cell phone. When we looked at the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystem, 40% of those in Alberta say that the ecosystem is effective. So it's not 50%, but 40%. It's up in the upper ranges, but it hasn't tipped over. Industry and professions viewed the innovation ecosystem highest at 42 and 45% respectively, with government again viewing the innovation ecosystem. And I'll elaborate on what we've learned about how the respondents view that ecosystem around leadership, resources, management processes, and infrastructure. But government, those with a primary interest in government do view the ecosystem as weakest. When we break the industry down, you'll see energy, transportation, and manufacturing are at the 50% level. Agriculture 47, and it drifts down to forestry, which probably has very little familiarity or reliance or involvement with the quote innovation ecosystem. When we look at the professions, again, a very low numbers in legal. We're right at 100%. So let's ignore that for the moment. But management was highest, those that have an interest in management and strategy. Then engineering, then finance. Weakest was human resources and communications. Public sector, pretty consistent between environment and health, government middle, then volunteers with education being very low. So education views, those with an interest in education view the innovation ecosystem as weakest, along with human resources and forestry. So if we did ask the question earlier, and I don't think we've reflected on it today. No, the extent to which economic diversification of the province is driven by or reliant on an innovation ecosystem, those numbers have always exceeded 90%. So the relationship between economic resilience and the innovation ecosystem from the perspective of the respondents is very tight. And you would expect, therefore, to see commitment and want to see a more positive reading of the innovation ecosystem than what we're seeing here.
Can I just comment, because I think we had 2021, but if we went back a decade before that, when the likes of Barry Mayer were running the innovation ecosystem and getting that going in the province, these numbers, especially the industry numbers, would have been half of that of what we have today. And I think the work of that goes back to his legacy, but also, the Alberta Innovates and others that have been on the line here. A lot of work has been done, especially in that energy, transportation, manufacturing, to be relevant and to increase. It'd be really interesting to love to get those agriculture and the forestry and the construction side up higher. But, compared where we were, this is remarkable growth from my perspective on the industry side. My other comment, though, is on the public sector side. Those are low. But what would happen if we actually started to think of those as industries, and that the innovation system was there to serve innovation in health, innovation in education, innovation in government? Would 2 decades be enough where we could actually see significant growth and evolution of those as industries, things we could export, or things that bring about a significant amount of innovation? So
these are fairly sensitive measures, and I'll reflect on data that we looked at last week. There has been continuous improvement. It's almost a parallel line since 2015, and economic resilience, with the innovation ecosystem showing a steady improvement, energy fluctuating with the price of oil and gas, but the innovation ecosystem not as sensitive to the price of oil. And that shouldn't be surprising, given where the resources come from and the supporting infrastructure of the innovation ecosystem. But a very interesting observation last week, I met with a fellow named Dennis Shepard, and he is the Dean of the School of Business of the J.R. Shaw School at NAIT. And he shared with me an insight that I was not aware of. NAIT and maybe SAIT and maybe some of the colleges are well aware that simply providing students with content anymore is not enough. And they have transformed their curriculum to try and develop students to become more intrapreneurial, if you will. And in fact, it was his words that he expects his graduates to be able to go work in industry and work for companies and be change agents, to be resilient, to be flexible, to be imaginative, to be creative, to not simply be administrators maintaining the status quo based on whatever knowledge they came out of university or college with. I was thrilled. In fact, I think I bought them the wine that day. But if that transition is underway within our education sector, Brad, to your point, I think industry and the province's economic resilience is going to see increasing booms as we move into the future, increasing diversification.
Yeah, I haven't met the gentleman, the dean, but he's on the right track. And corporate venturing, or you call it entrepreneurship, the corporate venturing side is where I think a lot of entrepreneurship will happen. I mean, we've done a lot politically and publicly to make entrepreneurism not as sexy as it used to be. And it's the ability. Yeah, and that's through COVID. It's through lots of different tax policies and et cetera. But it's, to be an entrepreneur, a lot of kids coming out of school today are not excited to be an entrepreneur. It's they haven't seen it pay off for a number of folks. They've seen the cyclicality. They've seen the mental health that comes with the inability to make payroll next month and curled up in a ball in your bed, not wanting to go to work. Those are a lot of the stories and the realities that young folks are learning and thinking about as they come out of school. So, the corporate venturing side, the entrepreneurship, will be a safer area where entrepreneurship can happen. So I like what I've just heard from the Dean of Business through you, Perry. So
I think it's also a reflection of an economy in transition. I mean, as I noted, we have seen since 2015, other than the spikes or the peaks associated with rapid shocks associated with oil. Other than that, we're seeing increased sentiment that the province is becoming more resilient. And in that regard, I can recall 25 years ago, and I've mentioned this before, bringing industry leaders together to talk about value added and telling me, it's hopeless. We are in the extraction business. We ship raw wheat, meat, fiber, timber, and gas out of here. Well, if that's not the case as it once was, then you're going to see more flexibility, more management, balancing supply and demand, not just administrators maintaining current policies and current practices, but having to adjust to fluctuations in supply and demand, whether it be global forces, interest rate changes, employment, even changes in political parties. All of these forces are having a bearing on our workforce. And to that extent, he made the point, we have to teach our labor force to be more flexible, more resilient. Role for government. We've sort of tripped into this one quickly. These are the items that we asked the respondents about, what roles were appropriate for government to make. And pretty consistent that formulating policies and employment incentives for encouraging small business innovation has typically been at the top. This is 2021 data, by the way. Promoting entrepreneurship and small business is high, and investing in research to offer long-term job creation. So the perspective here was government involvement in formulating policies and taking more of the long view. And considerably less as it relates to investing directly in immediate job creation or using government purchasing power or investing directly in technology commercialization. But there have been some shifts since 2021. You look at the far right and you see the reds, you're seeing what has declined, and the investing directly in research, the investing directly in projects offering immediate job, the immediacy, the promoting entrepreneurship of small businesses has dropped. And clearly the investment directly in technology commercialization. But what's risen is funding educational and training programs. The adaptation and adjustment that seems to be going on in the educational and training sector as it relates to our workforce has had a 17% jump, far more significant than any of the others, which is in a way why I reflected on the point that Dennis Shepard made with me last week, because if that is typical, if our educational and training infrastructure is becoming aware of the relevance that they play to our economy and are adapting, that's reflected in the data.
Oh, lots on this one. This is, well, first of all, I'll point out that the none of the above has grown 100%. Perry.
Yeah. Let's not reflect on that.
But so a couple of comments. First is the reduction on the research side is interesting, and we saw again through the year, the 2000s, the 2010s, the movement from basic research to applied research, and I'm not sure how successful that strategy has been. And there's an opportunity to rethink moving back into the importance of basic research in a lot of areas, and the attraction of talent around basic research. I think that's worthy of discussion unto itself. I'm a big believer where the highest one is, which is, the formulate policies and employ incentives for encouraging small business and innovation. That's very much, lay the groundwork and the environment and allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, as Guy Kawasaki used to say, which I think is the fundamental role. When it gets a little too instructive, though, on funding educational and training programs, so graduates can create new jobs, I worry about the effectiveness of, those decisions coming from government, or are they coming from the market and the educators? And so, the role of government is as a funder, hopefully not as a thinking that they're too smart to predict what is required. We've been doing this for 15 to 20 years under the current kind of policy environment, and productivity is going down, in terms of our labor productivity from new graduates. So, that I think, what this does is it exposes the need for a little deeper insight into some of the effectiveness of the role of government, not just the role, but effectiveness. So, and I think you're starting to see that in the number 2 and number 3 here, which is, the effectiveness of government of investing in, projects that offer immediate job creation, which is a lot of foreign direct investment sometimes. It's pretty low on the list and dropping. And the reason is that's still an element of picking winners. And anytime government starts picking courses, picking winners, picking, technologies to invest in, I just think we go down a dark path, and a little nervous about what lies ahead on this one, because everyone will overcorrect for new technologies coming out, and think everybody's, they're very smart again, and want to get ahead of the curve again, because the rate of technology introduction is increasing, and that usually when government gets very excited to make bad decisions. So I worry about a couple of these things from that perspective.
Reflecting on the initial episode that we had with John Liston, where we got into what questions would you like to ask candidates, and that led us in, of course, with the survey on economy, is a lot of questions about the economy and candidates. And then the second session with Trevor Lewington got deeper into how complex the economy has become of late, with all of the global forces, whether it be Ukraine and supply chain and COVID and aging of the workforce. I mean, the length of my arm of issues that you've got to be wrestling with has made it almost impossible to think about how can government wrestle with so many different issues with something so simple as investment or a direct investment or interest rates, where one of the instruments that they have is, of course, our post-secondary institutions, which are supposed to be at arm's length from government and not politicized. And while we do have in our technical institutes more of an applied orientation, it's extremely complex. And Trevor was of the view, when I prompted him directly, that the impact of government on the economy is probably as much a local or municipal factor or regional in nature than it is a provincial national one. And other than the negotiating trade agreements, but we'll get a little bit of that color with the next slide. When we asked in earlier discussion, it was highlighted the bipolar viewpoint that Alberta's economic resilience attributed in large part to the Calgary region that viewed the economy as resilient and wanting less government intervention, and the Edmonton region, the other element of bipolar, viewing the economy as not very resilient and wanting more government intervention. There's a bipolar dilemma of the relationship of government to the economy is viewed in one portion of the province as high and another low. And the other regions agree with the Calgary region other than intervention for infrastructure development. So when we ask Edmonton, and now I'm breaking this down regional, and this gets quite rich to see where the view of government sits. Edmonton views better than Calgary or more than Calgary, and I'm just comparing Calgary and Edmonton here. Investing in technology commercialization was 26% higher in Edmonton than for Calgary, 20% higher for projects immediate job creation. Investing in research for long, 11% higher than Calgary. Formulating policies, 11%. Virtually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of the measures, 1%, were higher in Edmonton than Calgary. Calgary, in only 2 instances, were any of these measures viewed as more appropriate than in Edmonton? Use of government purchasing power, irrelevant, 1%. Negotiating trade agreements, a little bit higher than Edmonton. So you're seeing here the bipolar, not just the bipolar split, but what the focus is. And Edmonton is much more immediate and much more direct government help. The other reflected what were the other regions. The other regions had a much higher view of the role of government in technology commercialization. And that's probably the lack of infrastructure that's desperately needed, whether it be in broadband or incubators. Resources and infrastructure were viewed as weak in the rural areas. And I think that's probably why the investing directly in technology commercialization showed up higher in the rural areas, significantly higher. And with regard to negotiating trade agreements, Southern Alberta didn't view that they wanted a lot of government involvement, implying either they were unnecessary, they could handle it themselves.
Yeah, interesting, huge discrepancy. I've just finished a project working for one of the major banks, interviewing a series of clients in the agriculture industry across the country, from potato farmers in PEI to grain farmers in Saskatchewan. It's so different every time we start the interview because we're from Toronto and the bank is from Toronto. They associate that with almost Ottawa government, something central, and it's really interesting to see how welcomed you are in different conversations. And the further you go west towards Alberta, the resentment towards anything that smells like government increases significantly. And the more you go north in the country, we're starting to see the same. And what's interesting here is you've got the tale of 2 very different cities, one that welcomes government and one that says stay off my land and stay out of my business and stay out of my back pocket. And where this gets very complicated is governments want to initiate and launch a single policy over a region, whether that be the Alberta government or the national government. And you can't do that anymore. I mean, you've got such differences in geography, in geology, in culture, in history, and beliefs around what government's there to do and not do. I think this page screams this out at me, that, you know, the way we have single policies for an entire region, I think will further create a disparate and a, you call it bipolar. Not sure that's the right word. It's more polarized, but bipolar kind of means mood swings. I don't think the mood swings. It just gets further entrenched, you know, in the same mood, further entrenched in the cities that we have in the province and what we're seeing across the country. So, you know, I think this is kind of the world we're in right now, where it's very tough to legislate anything across the country in a single policy anymore.
Well, there's clearly a view that politics and the economy work well in Edmonton, but don't work well together. They're not comfortable bedmates in Calgary. So that has bearing on what's happening later on this month, where we have two parties with disparate perspectives that fit our regional perspectives, one better fitting for Calgary and the other better fitting for Edmonton.
Well, again, in Edmonton, you know, 1 in every 3 houses, right? So if it's not the house on it's not your house and it's not the house on your left, it's the neighbor on the right that, you know, your neighbors with. And as a result, you know, that's very much part of the Edmonton mindset.
Peter, you've got a question that I think is relevant to this slide.
Whatever happened to the Alberta Research Council? I mean,
yeah, well, I was the consultant on the restructuring of that. And so it was Alberta Research Council, Alberta Ingenuity Corp, something called CORE, which was, I can't remember what it was, one other group, and they came together to create the Alberta Innovates system. And through a couple iterations now, it really falls all under Alberta Innovates, which that's the evolution of it. And so back a few slides when I talked about and kind of complemented that in terms of the focus on the energy side and the manufacturing side and some of the industrial side, they've really taken a huge focus on that. I think they've shifted their attention a little bit on the AI and others right now, but you know, certainly they built, you know, a strong presence back into industry, which they needed to do after that consolidation happened.
And they take a regional perspective with their regional innovation orientation. So in that regard, they recognize the importance of distinguishing the different infrastructures and the different requirements of the individual regions. And I think that's a credit to them.
You made a comment, and when you talked about the other, not Edmonton and Calgary, but the other on this slide, you know, a lot of, I think where government had it right during the 90s is to create or to build pre-capitalized infrastructure and then get out of the way. Mm-hmm. So how do you build a open access lab? How do you have an open access, you know, fab or facility and allow the private sector to come in and use it on an ad use basis, complemented with some very talented research and talent they could never keep on staff, and then really allow that to take a little bit more of a market feel. I still think that is one of the most effective uses of government funding in the innovation system, and clearly it was needed in the other category into the rural. So.
Well, one of the points of contention or tension in the province has been the schism between Alberta Innovates and economic development as a department. Is, you know, who's really in charge, who gets credit for what, whose responsibility is it? That really has not yet been settled. We've seen significant cutbacks in funding to Alberta Innovates in the last few years. And I think that might be reflective of the decline that we've seen last week in the recognition of the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of Alberta's innovation ecosystem. It's the first time it was flat in the last, well, since we've been recording since 2015. It went pretty well flat. So something has been taking in the innovation ecosystem that was significant. And I don't think it was in the economy per se, which rose significantly in that period when the innovation ecosystem was viewed as going flat. I think it had to do with the confidence that people had of the continuing commitment to the development or the partnership with government in that innovation ecosystem. I'm going to share with you some comments that came from ChatGPT. We fed all of the data that we've just been looking at into ChatGPT and said, are there any things that you could recommend that have come out of the comments? So what we're referring to here is the respondents in the survey provided summary comments on virtually anything they wanted to speak of. And we asked ChatGPT, could they summarize the highlights? And this is what came up. Defend Alberta against Ottawa's anti-hard carbon agenda, lead through effective governance, and avoid investing taxpayer money directly. Instead, focus on funding serious research to respond courageously and holistically to the changing future. By the way, I'm reading this because many of you may be viewing this webinar on a cell phone or subsequently, and the print would be awfully small for a PowerPoint. The second one, and by the way, that one earlier does reflect what we did in fact see as priority for the role of government. Create incentives for made in Canada products, mold the market to align with civic needs, enable progress without direct involvement in industry operations, invest in social programs. The first time we've really seen that. Streamline the legal system and play a significant role in tax, business policy, trade agreements, and infrastructure. This appears to be a rather generic statement that ChatGPT may well pull from any question regarding economic diversification. And I cite that because we did ask ChatGPT early on in the webinar series what might be done to diversify the economy. And some of these points came out even at that point, before we even gave it the comments from the survey. Develop policies that provide long-term market stability, support easy access to small angel funds for young entrepreneurs, follow global investment trends for sustainability and emerging technologies. And then prioritize green jobs and solutions, affordable education, long-term environmental policies, stay proactive, use government purchasing power to empower local companies, although we saw that was relatively low with one region's exception, and raise awareness among citizens about government initiatives, clearly wanting to identify areas where government is involved, I won't get into effectiveness. Consider the long-term trends in financial markets and economy, while focus on fundamental drivers such as math, science, engineering, and global markets. Ensure balanced policies and avoid excessive benefits to the oil and gas industry. There's a lot in there, and you could parse pieces out and ask it to prioritize, but we're going to be feeding the commentaries of the commentators of the webinar series in the next webinar. Brad, Trevor Lewington, and John Liston will be asked to sit on a panel with Natalie Gibson being the commentator of that panel, and we'll be feeding them recommendations that have been derived throughout this series to have a discussion about whether any one of them or all of them or some segment of them may well survive. And given that there's an election that has some bearing on the economy, it would be nice to have that on the table before we wrap things up on the 25th. Brad, do you want to make any comments about this overall summary, or as we wrap up, any concluding comments that you'd like to share with us before I open up the discussion to the group at large?
No, sure. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure, but it's interesting. You can put survey results into ChatGPT and come up with some pretty interesting things. I still recommend people go to the library and pull out some history books and find very similar things maybe that can be said. And I go back to the days of Premier Lougheed and Wilfrid Laurier, who actually had very similar manifestos, which was, if we build an entrepreneurial and self-reliant culture, it allows for small, smart, stable government that provides the lowest possible tax environment, which attracts massive foreign investment and local investment, and that then stimulates greater entrepreneurial growth. If you really break the manifesto of government down from my perspective, and that crosses certainly political lines, if we get too far away from that, we just build a huge government. And if you get back to the basics, which I think you can find through history, I think there's a lot to learn still.
One of the interesting challenges here, Brad, is if our economy is global, and clearly as a commodity producer, we get involved in global trade agreements or global supply chains. Many of the countries expect government to be at the table when you're dealing with trading. Many countries want to see government at the table as a sign of respect and involvement. And therein lies one of the dilemmas, because from a political perspective, our economy, based on some of the points that you've made, is suspect about relying too much on the role of government. And yet other jurisdictions, which we may want to partner with, look to see and expect to see more government presence. Therein lies one of the challenges you've got as a negotiator or as a country.
Well, outside of trade agreements, I mean, the world's changed quite significantly, and we've got the emergence of three theaters, an Asian theater, a North American theater, and a European theater. And most of our, the next 10 to 20 years will be very much continental, which from a Canada, US, Mexico approach will reduce the need for government at that table. When we redraw supply chains and we become a little bit more integrated into continental energy policy, water policy, agriculture project or food policy, once the government's established, the trading relationship, most of the negotiation will be done private to private in North America. So I think, we're entering a little bit into a different world. So the old way of government thinking that those international relations, the amount of effort we spent on those international relations might be redrawn over the next little while. So,
well, that's very helpful. I'm really appreciative of you bringing that perspective, because that I think enriches the discussion that may well follow. So I'm going to ask the audience if they've got comments or questions that they wish to make. So I'll stop the screen share. I've already noted what our episode will be for next week. Barry, go ahead.
Well, first of all, Brad, thanks for the kind comments. I think that one size doesn't fit all. And we can go back, we were talking about culture, or you were talking about culture, and you can go back still. Northern Alberta, central north, settled from the east, basically by Europeans. Southern Alberta, up to north of Calgary, probably Red Deer, was settled out of the US. Very different mindset. And when we were in government, we had to treat it differently. And that's why you see such a divergence still, in my opinion, in the results from the two big cities. There's a whole bunch of stuff there that we have to grow up and realize that one size doesn't fit all. What you do well in your own personal environment, in your corporate environment, isn't necessarily going to work elsewhere, even in the province. The country has to learn that too. So without that, again, thank you, Brad, for your comments, and it was an insightful discussion.
Yeah, I think you've underscored the challenges of thinking that government can be a significant agent in diversification. Maybe given the global nature of what we're into, but I think as a byproduct of the extraordinary complexity. I mean, it's the complexity you see in growing a small business. There is no textbook. There is no single answer. You're having to be nimble almost on a daily basis to capitalize on opportunities and fend off and mitigate the risks. There is no single textbook that will guarantee you success in a small business or in the market.
Yes, I appreciate very much the comments. Barry just had some and mentioned as well, and kind of like the impact that perceptions and background have on the way that we look things and the paths that we'd like to see. But one comment in particular really struck me, and Brad Ferguson, you mentioned something about, I'm probably not saying it right, but Edmonton kind of has a rural type of mindset. I never thought of anything like that. But it was kind of like the first or second or third generation moving into a big city hasn't really fully adapted. In fact, made change in attitudes quite a bit. It reminds me of discussions within the government in Ottawa at a certain point in time with radicalism, that the actual problem wasn't the initial immigrants into Canada, that it was tending to show up in the third and fourth generation that had never lived outside of Canada. They had grown up in Canada, but that's where kind of the resentment and frustration surfaced. But this is the opposite case. It's rural people going to the big city. But I never thought of looking at Edmonton as having a rural mindset. I've never really looked at urbanite populations as being anything like rural populations in a lot of the mindsets on many issues. That's just a comment. I found that very interesting comment.
I'll hang around. We've got more surprises for you. We get to the recommendations. Yeah, I mean, we've seen some demographic shifts, and Bill, you made reference to that last week of the socio-demographics of Calgary are very different than what they were, and yet it has retained that entrepreneurial, almost quasi-American orientation, confidence in free enterprise and market forces, corporate presence. Edmonton, while it's had immigration, it tends to be immigration coming from an Indigenous population of the north, and some immigration, but not reflective to the same extent of what's been happening in Calgary.
But I would say that having lived in Ontario at a particular point in time, and I was kind of bouncing between Ontario and Quebec, there's a radical shift in Ontario that occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And so that this attitude in Calgary, I don't think that's going to be anything like it is now in another 5-10 years.
Mm-hmm.
There's just too much of a population change, completely different backgrounds and opinions. This thing about should government be involved? And when you're working in Ottawa and the guy beside you, a colleague, is he's not a socialist, he's a Marxist, right? And that's fine, but it's just not the same way to think about stuff at all. And there's more and more and more changes like that. So I find this whole thing of generational attitudinal changes. And I also think the losing position of competitiveness in almost all areas of business and science and technology, and that's a really huge change that's occurring. I don't think anybody wants to see or recognize that. It's kind of brushed under.
Yeah, I think, Bill, to pick up on that point, we did a survey or a study a few years ago about purchasing and procurement in Alberta, and saw that the procurement policies were consistently reflective of social engineering objectives. We had lost the sense of merit and using the instrument to advance economic objectives. It was being used to achieve equity and achieve social objectives. And maybe that's why people are not interested in government, relying on government purchasing power as an instrument for economic diversification. That's really not been its focus. Do you want to be a critic there, Brad, or elaborate?
No, I mean, I subscribe to it. If you look at even our foreign policy, a total failure of foreign policy in the last 8 years, because it's very social engineering driven. It's a feminist social policy or foreign policy that impeded our values on other nations, that was rejected at the door, and it compromised a lot of our trade negotiations that we have going on. So, that's of concern, and there's a point in time where that'll get corrected, I think. So.
Look, I think you ought to think politics. You're a lot franker than most people I've been listening to over the last some odd years.
I know that Brad was running the ESG office for the province of Alberta for a while, and I'm wondering if you gained some insights into how accounting for environmental, social, and governance matters affects the economy. Because through our conversation, we're talking about the various social and cultural differences between cities and regions. And just, okay, there you go, Brad. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, it's new at a jurisdictional level. So we were the first to attempt it at a jurisdictional level, and it was done primarily for defensive purposes first. to prevent divestment outside of, from the oil sands, because we started to see divestment move into other areas of the economy, not just from the energy sector. So it started as a defensive, and then I think my job was to broaden people's perspective to realize we need to, this is a sword and a shield. And to go on offense, if you have your narrative put together and your policy environment put together properly, you start to appeal to a whole different element of capital that's available, which we are in a global race to attract capital and talent. Even as the government itself, the inability to attract people under the age of 35 because they don't see the government caring about the things that they care about. So by wrapping your existing policy environment in a ESG framework, even with different colors, like we adopted different colors, which Premier didn't like the first time, but we got him there. You can present yourself differently. So in Alberta, we did it, and it felt like we were fighting gravity the entire time. We were pushing the ball up the hill. It's interesting to do it in Ontario where they get it. They're like, no, we want to be the absolute magnet for all capital, all $130 trillion of capital that needs to go to sustainable based investing or transition finance. They see it as a sword, not just as a shield, and they're winning. It's being embraced and they're winning. So, the work we did in Alberta, I think, one of the reasons I left is I knew, Premier Kenney was going to resign or step down.
Mom?
And we go through
I can't respond on the thing if it, thanks.
I don't. Okay, someone's look at Brad. Whenever someone's talking to their mom, we have to take a time out. Okay, that's over. You can
just say hi to her for me. But we knew there we'd get caught in about 20 months of political cycles, elections, et cetera, red zones, and et cetera. And but hopefully that sees the light of day. And Alberta came out with a document about a month ago, which was the Emissions Reduction and Energy Development Plan. And it's the first time it really brought together the work we did at the ESG Secretariat of balancing and a broadening of our energy mix while still reducing emissions. And I think it's the first government in the country that's really linked those two together. So a lot of work has been done well by the bureaucracy. It'll be really interesting to see after May 29th how that's either embraced or thrown to the curb. But Alberta's actually got the pieces together to win this. But it's going to take an element of leadership now. So.
Well, it may be a point of advocacy. I do hope you bring that point forward in the discussion next week. I think that would be a surprising and an important perspective to share. Ken, go ahead. Unmute. Yeah.
Hi, Perry. Thank you. You got my interest with procurement. So I've written over 200 RFPs in government since 1997, a lot of large ones. And what I find was there's a real lack, has been and still is a lack of leadership in procurement, not thinking about outcomes or what people really want. It was more about protecting individual views, not even following trade law, just individual views on how to handle that. I've worked with John Havelock on a number of occasions on procurement. There needs to be a shift, and I'm just talking with a few folks in government now. There's a real interest to change what was going on and correct it. So a good example is FlexTrack, which in my opinion violates trade law on many fronts. Price gouging or price setting, and just the way they evaluate is really inconsiderate of what's really going on. So it's more about price than value. And they need a real shift around that. And Perry, you and I have talked about this before. Thank you.
Thank you for that elaboration. All right. I want to thank you, Brad. No surprises, informative, intelligent, experienced. You've obviously thought through the ESG initiative in depth. I was thinking as you were reflecting on your role, not to promote ESG as an ideology, but to bring it forward as a pragmatic option on how do you properly market Alberta in such a way to make it attractive to investors. I had a role some years in government as director of privatization, which sounded like an ideology, to make a transition from it being an ideology to being a management option when market forces were mature and could be used to govern standards and costs. So I think we've each had some experience in government of helping government transition from a political perspective or an ideology to one that is pragmatic and important for the time. So I thank you for today. I thank you for being a colleague and a friend. So thanks for joining us today. And on behalf of the group, we look forward to seeing you again next week. So ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap up for today. Thank you, Tom, for the applause. I'm sure that was directed at Brad, and we'll leave it at that. Take care. All have a good weekend.